We're talking about the fact that Angelo Roncalli was very much involved with all of the leftists that he could possibly be involved with uh, from the very beginning of his career, effectively, including his time as a seminarian. Remember, Buonaiuti was his friend as a seminarian, and then worked as also functioned as his assistant priest at his ordination. He is very much a protege of Bishop Radini Tedeschi of Bergamo, who is of the line of Cardinal Rampolla, Leo XIII, Secretary of State, who himself put forth the policy of the Calimont, rallying to the Masonic Third Republic. And Leo XIII was, it is true, rather a liberal in practice. Not in theory, certainly not, as none of the accommodationist popes ever were, as far as conveying the faith, as far as maintaining good disciplinary practices in the church, safeguarding the sacred liturgy and so forth. All popes are the same when it comes to that. And we talk about accommodationists versus those who are more stringent. Then we're talking about how to deal with problems in the practical order. We're not talking about in the theoretical, only practical order. But that actually changes when we get to John the 23rd, obviously. And that is the argument to be made, which is that eventually this idea that, well, maybe it's a better idea of just for us to just to give in on non-essentials, that the idea of giving in became much too strong, and then started the idea was maybe we should just give in on everything, give in on the essentials, just give up the faith. And that way we'll attract people to the Catholic Church. Because ultimately that was the idea of Vatican II, was trying to make the church, the Catholic Church, attractive to the modern world by getting rid of the Catholic faith. And it turned into the biggest flop of all time. the biggest failed project ever. Because ultimately the Catholic Church is successful when it is the Catholic Church. The church prior to Vatican II, as we've talked about, it's not one of the things we're really focusing on, but it is true in certainly in a material sense, and probably not only in a material sense, but definitely in that way, the church was flourishing prior to Vatican II. And one of the most immediately striking effects of Vatican II was the fact that all of that went away. I mean, the Novus Ordo still has numbers to this day. It's still large in that sense, certainly compared to our numbers, but it's a shadow of the numbers that the church had before Vatican II. And it's just going down. I mean, the numbers are still high objectively. There's still large numbers of people certainly on the books being members, but the number of those people who come to Mass, such as it is, are terrible in comparison to the number of people who are labeled Catholic. And their numbers are just going down. It's just continuing. It's just in free fall at this point. You look at the numbers from even over the last few decades, long after Vatican II, looking at how things have continued to decay, even in relatively recent decades, relatively recent years. It's just that is one thing that comes to the forefront immediately, is that this is just in free fall. So if the Novus Ordo has large numbers still at the moment, the way to think of it is that it's large the way that the carcass of a whale is large. In other words, sitting there, it's just this big rotting mass of putrid flesh just sitting there. That's the largeness. So whatever largest the Novus Ordo, that's what it has. It's the largeness of a rotting corpse at this point. A shadow of the prosperity of the church prior to Vatican II, which, it's true, Pius XII oversaw and helped to fuel that, certainly. But Leo XIII, again, was rather liberal in the practical order, urging Catholics to rally to the Third Republic while still being, and read his encyclicals, all perfect in every sense, really. Not only the Latin style, which he probably wrote himself, he probably composed his own encyclicals. Popes don't necessarily do that. They could very easily delegate the job of actually composing it to somebody else. No doubt he consulted theologians when he composed them, but he was certainly had the expertise in Latin. Did Joachim Petrizzi as a private scholar to write Latin of those encyclicals himself. So when you read that and maybe going through those as a Latin exercise, how difficult that is, he just sat down and wrote that. Certainly he was capable of it. He knew Latin probably potentially to the full extent possible to a human being to know it. Or you could argue that. Certainly is one of the most prominent Latinists in the history of the church, Joachim Petrizzi, just as a private scholar. And it's actually, as incredible as it might seem, there is actually audio recording of him reciting, I think it was the Ave Maria. But you could tell that he knows perfectly all of the long and short syllables in every Latin word. He pronounces, he elongates every long vowel and keeps every short vowel short perfectly. So it's incredible as it is. There is actually some audio recording of Pope Leo XIII, so you might be able to find that sometime. Clearly he was an expert in that. So coming back though to looking at Roncalli. Rampolla was not elected in the conclave of 1903, as we saw, and therefore Radini Tedeschi did not become Secretary of State, which may well have happened. And the episcopal government of Radini Tedeschi began with the collaboration of Roncalli, who said that Radini Tedeschi does indeed give the impression that he was moved by the sole desire to innovate. Although the biographer, Roncalli's biographer, talking about this, says that this is true and false, true in a way, really true in substance, but not untrue with regard to the accidents, so to speak. He wanted to change the substance, but not the accidents. He wanted to, wanted to bring about innovation, and is what he effectively admits here, but at the same time retaining the glorious tradition of his diocese and interpreting them in harmony with new conditions and the new needs of the times. So perfectly in accordance with modernist methods. And that this is, as Father Ricoso points out, the ambition of Roncalli himself when he became Pope, supposedly, more than 40 years later, that he would express in similar terms the revivification of tradition by aggiornamento, updating. So also, we pointed this out last time, that Radini Tedeschi went on to gain the merit of the reputation of being a red bishop, revolutionary, and revolution being associated very closely with the color red associated with revolution, and supporting the strike of the League of Workers at Ranica in September 1909, and also consider the general geopolitical context, for lack of a better term, in which this is happening. This is just 8 years before the final revolution, the final communist revolution in Russia that would overthrow the Tsarist government and establish the Soviet Union ultimately. And just a few years, in fact, 1905, there was another revolution in Russia prior to obviously 12 years prior to the 1917 revolution, in which the Tsar was almost overthrown. So it was a great deal of revolutionary agitation at this time, all being fueled by the likes of Vladimir Lenin. Though actually, at this time, he was exiled for a while and lived in Zurich, Switzerland, and was returned during the war to Russia by the Germans with the idea of just causing trouble for Russia. I mentioned it before. Germany was big into that during the war. They just tried to give their enemies as much trouble at home as they possibly could. And one of the ways in which they did that was by fomenting revolutions. They did that in Ireland also. They fomented. They helped. Or they were certainly interested in it, in helping to foment uprisings, and so they were. You have to study the details of it more, but they certainly were not, as far as their actual involvement, but they were certainly not unhappy about, for example, the Easter 1916 uprising in Dublin. the Irish were agitating for independence themselves, and the Germans were definitely interested in helping them just tie down as many British troops as possible within the British Isles themselves. And so again, it's in the midst of, we're looking at this here, this supporting a workers' strike in the middle of a period that's heavy with revolutionary sentiment. So you very easily, therefore, get the reputation of being revolutionary yourself by supporting such a strike. And indeed, that's exactly what Radini Tedeschi did, was he supported this strike of a League of Workers in 1909, and became known as a Red Bishop as a result. So Don Roncalli, notice here, hastened to stand by his bishop with the help of an article that appeared in the publication Diocesan Life in November 1909, which spoke of a preference of Christ for the underprivileged, the weak, the oppressed. And here he announced one of the major themes of the liberation theology of the 1970s. So that was a way of really spreading around socialism and communism under the guise of theology. Of course, in the Novus Ordo, that goes perfectly well, but that's shocking that should be the case in 1909. He's anticipating all of the garbage of the 1970s decades in advance. That's how far ahead of his time, quote unquote, Roncalli was. So the fact is that the Ranica episode was not an isolated act of charity or justice, supposedly in any case, of the Bishop of Bergamo or his secretary, but was included in a more vast formulation called Christian Unionism. So in 1906, Radini Tedeschi founded the Labor Office, which provided advice to the unions of the Bergamo region, and its headquarters were in the Casa del Popolo, the House of the People, where Don Roncalli regularly gave conferences on the history of the church. So just a note on unions. They are actually a result of economic liberalism. So contrasting the system of economic liberalism with the guild system of the Middle Ages, it actually becomes very striking just how radical, in fact, free market economies are. That idea of free market economic liberalism, that is actually quite radical when you consider, well, for one thing, the guild system was demolished effectively with the French Revolution. And consider the guild system had a whole set of rules as to protecting quality of work, days on which work was forbidden, who was allowed to work where in which trade, and so on and so forth. All of that is very good. All of those are things that need to be regulated. Everything needs there's in a sense a rule for everything, not in a communistic sense, but clearly in everything, in every act, every human act, there are things to take into account to ensure that this is a good and a meritorious act rather than a sinful one. So in that sense, everything needs to be regulated, and the guild system was a Catholic way of regulating the way that people work and make a living, which they need to do, of course, but that has to be done according to all the correct principles. So, for example, according to the guild system, it was forbidden for members of guilds to work on Sundays, obviously, but other days as well, holidays of obligation, and so forth. There were standards that they were required to meet for as far as their quality of work was concerned. They were not allowed to be cheaters. Cheaters were not allowed into the guilds. People who might defraud their customers were not allowed into the guilds. The guilds provided for other things, say, for example, for funeral expenses, things like that. So it was a very good system. Yes, you could find some examples of abuses, of problems arising within the guilds, but any such problems are accidental. There'll be bad people even in the most perfect possible system. That is the state of the human race. That no matter how great a system you come up with, there will still be bad people in it who will cause trouble. But when you have a system that is in itself correct, that will be reduced to a minimum. Whereas, consider economic liberalism. At first, that might sound not too bad anyway. the idea, especially given the situation in which we find ourselves, the idea that you can do whatever you want when it comes to making a living. First, that might sound okay, but then you realize what that means. For example, you could have a small business shoemaker in some town someplace, and then a big corporation could come in and completely destroy that business, offer prices much lower because they can afford to do that, and which they don't particularly need. But just to make a few extra bucks, they can completely destroy all of these small shoemaking businesses in a city or a town, completely destroying those people's livelihoods with no obligation to help them back to their feet after doing that. No obligation to hire them or anything. Just they could just destroy their businesses and be left completely unaccountable for that. So, and that's just an example of the evil effects of economic liberalism. But it makes sense that those who come up with those ideas would not think of that. I mean, it seems, once you consider that, it itself seems obvious that that could happen. But remember that liberalism is really based on a denial of original sin and its effects. It has this idea that people are all basically good. And yes, there are a few bad people, but in general, if you let people do whatever they want and believe whatever they want to believe, that people will choose to do what is morally good. People will choose to believe the truth. And that is not true. That is most emphatically not true. When people are allowed to do whatever they want, they sin, typically. People will choose evil. Anything that appears good and pleasurable to them, however false and evil it might in fact be, however sinful it might be, they will choose whatever they perceive as being good to them in some way. And so if it appears good to some large corporation, allowed to do whatever it wants because of the principles of economic liberalism, they're allowed to form big corporations which become effectively business empires. If they're allowed to do that, then they're allowed also to go wherever they want and destroy any small businesses they want, because no one should be prevented from doing that if he wants to. So immediately the problems, once you dig a little bit deeper, the problems become obvious. And so unions are a result of that system, of the system of economic liberalism, because again, under the system of economic liberalism, employers are free to do whatever they want. There's nothing to prevent them from making as much money as they want. That's the promise of liberalism. You can make as much money as you want when it comes to economics. That's one of the tantalizing items of liberalism. So these employers see that and think, great, I will build up a business and I will hire workers and I will pay them as absolutely little as I can and keep as much money as possible for myself. Well, obviously that's unjust towards those workers, that the employers are not paying them sufficiently to live. And so these workers, in their desperation, say, okay, we need to get together, form unions here, form alliances, which they call unions, to put up a fight against these tyrannical employers who, if they can help it, will not pay us at all, effectively. So they start forming these unions, which in itself is not something evil. They're allowed to, it's permissible for people to band together in defense of their legitimate interests. In this case, just talking about being given sufficient means to make a living, that in itself is not evil. But these unions themselves have, to this point, developed into a way of, to means of oppression all on their own. They become very powerful, these unions, again, in a system in which nobody can be prevented from doing whatever he wants. In principle, these unions have become themselves quite large and make all kinds of demands of their own. And they also, again, they tend to turn leftist. They tend to turn leftist. Remember that all of the promises of socialism and communism are all made to the working class. And unions are, of course, large groups, large alliances of working class people. So such groups are especially susceptible to those promises, the likes of Karl Marx, who promise all these things. Oh yes, we'll make things better. We'll make everything into a paradise for the working man, which never, that promise is always false. It always ends up being exactly the opposite of a paradise, more like hell on earth. Every communist regime ever has turned into that, in effect. Just absolute nightmare conditions in every way. Just the number is just count the number of people who have been slaughtered by communist regimes, and you can see just from that it's not exactly paradise on earth. But that is their explicitly stated goal, and that's not just an accurate characterization of it, which it would be even if they hadn't said it. But they have said that their goal is to build paradise on earth. Remember, that's the reason why Lenin said we must eliminate from the minds of the people any kind of idea of a deity, any idea of a life after this life. Because if they have some idea of that, then they will not want to build paradise on earth. That is their explicitly stated goal, no question. So unions are really a result of economic liberalism. It's a terrible system, obviously. Once you start looking at the fact that all this rises up naturally from that. When you have a system that denies original sin and its effects, but handed to people who are in fact afflicted with original sin, or even in the case of those who are baptized, at least its effects, and you give them that system, all of those effects will take their course. Those effects will become themselves the causes of many evils. And therefore, all of the problems of oppressive employers and then unions rising up, which then themselves turn oppressive, all of the leftism that those labor unions tend to swallow, all of that comes about as a direct result of economic liberalism, as a per se result rather than per accidens. And any evils that may have arisen in the guild system were per accidens, were accidental. Whereas this all rises directly up from that. This is what happens when you hand such a system to people who are afflicted with the effects of original sin. So Christian unionism is an attempt to baptize all of that, which was really just meant ecclesiastics, or at least Catholics, getting involved in this leftism. So, by contrast, St. Pius X recognized in this nascent unionism a grave counterfeit of the pre-revolutionary guilds praised by Leo XIII, which we talked a bit about. Fighting this supposedly Christian unionism would be the final great battle of the pontificate of St. Pius X, doubtless one of the most important. This is an author quoted by, not the usual author of John the 23rd, but a different author who talks about this, that's quoted by Father Ricosa. So the battle was engaged under the inspiration of St. Pius X in Civiltà Cattolica, with a series of articles by Fathers Monetti and Chiodano, published from February 21st to October 3rd, 1914, in which were condemned Christian unionism, instrument of class struggle, social justice, supposedly, social justice, which confuses charity and justice, and solidarity, which, far from being a truth, is an accumulation of aberrations, in that it sets itself on numerous points against the natural order. So, this social justice, again, confusing charity and justice. Yes, it's true that those who have means, who have a great deal of wealth, ought to, out of charity, help those who are not so well off. That is true, and when they need it, that ought to be done. But then that's a question of practicing the virtue of charity rather than of justice. Yes, it's true, employers are bound in justice to pay their employees a living wage, but that this social justice asserts such things as that those who have that the wealth of the wealthy ought to be taken from them and redistributed. That's justice. That's justice, which it's not. People who have in fact worked to gain wealth are entitled to that. And perhaps out of charity they ought to help those who are in need, but they cannot be punished by having their wealth taken from them when they've worked for that. Or perhaps in some cases they've inherited it. It's not a crime to have inherited the wealth of someone else who himself worked hard to acquire that wealth. Right, that's social justice is this false idea anyway, confuses charity and justice. And solidarity, in a bad sense, of course, solidarity can have a good sense, but this is, if you mean that in a bad sense, the one that sets itself, accumulation of aberrations, that sets itself against the natural order, that indicates a denial, really, of the natural gradation of levels within society. That it's true that in some sense men are equal, and as much as all have immortal souls and all will be judged with perfect justice by Christ the judge at their judgments, but not all men are equal in terms of the level of society into which they are born, or perhaps to which they rise. In any case, they are not all equal with regard to the level of society in which they are constituted. That is not true. All men are not equal in that sense. And that is, again, natural. It is the principle enunciated by St. Thomas that there can be no coordination without subordination. And if everybody tries to be a chief and there have no Indians left, as the popular analogy goes, you have too many chiefs and not enough Indians, you end up, everybody wants to be a head. Well, just imagine a creature that's made up of only heads. Imagine the kind of monster that is, right? Every head thinking for itself, wanting to do its own thing. That is the situation that you end up with when you assert that everybody is equal. In principle, that's where you'll go. Again, it will never work out. It will never work out. And even all of these liberals acknowledge that. That's why you get such ideas as Rousseau's social contract. Because the idea is that every individual in principle is good and perfectly free, and there should be zero, if possible, limitations on that. But we've come together to form societies to make life a little easier for ourselves, and because we've done that now in large numbers, it's impossible for every individual for the masses, to exercise authority, so they just delegate that to other people who will just take care of the administration of things. So that's why, and that's as part of the social contract, those people are constituted in authority. It's just that. It's just based on agreements. That there's nothing natural to man about this. It's just we've come together to do this, and we've arranged it this way artificially just to make life a bit easier. So you can see how all this liberalism leads to all of these evils that we're talking about. And again, it is natural that there should be gradations. This is why gradations in society. This is why all the Catholic political philosophers is one of the reasons why they say that monarchy is in itself the best form of government, because it is the most in accordance with nature. Most clearly has all of those levels, those gradations of society marked out, culminating in one head of state, and very clearly maintains that and demands respect for the authority, with the clear idea that the authority that head has comes from God. So this is one of the reasons that Catholic political philosophers maintain monarchy as the best form of government in itself. So these articles, published in the Civiltà Cattolica, paved the way for the publication of the motu proprio by St. Pius X on this subject, while a decree was published which forbade Italian priests to be involved in unions, or to live with them, or to speak for them, for fear that they would appear to participate in the evils which often derive from such institutions. So, one thing on what is a motu proprio, you see those words, the first thing that comes to mind is Ratzinger and his Summorum Pontificum allowing the John the 23rd Mass to be used, which came out he issued that in 2007. But real popes have in fact issued motu proprios, and what that means is, well, by his own motion. So motus, there, a fourth declension noun if you're up on your Latin forms, but then proprius, one's own thing. So by his own motion, the Pope just puts out this document on his own. So he decides, I'm going to put this out. Then he puts it out. So it's really a document in that sense directly from the Pope. And so that is a motu proprio, in which he talks about these things, and a decree also forbids Italian priests from being involved in unions. Because this is generally true of the Church. The Church does not want to get involved in these matters. It's true, of course, the Church is very much interested in justice and seeing to it that all men are treated justly. Emphasis on that, of course. but does not want the clergy to get involved in such things as this, because then the church appears to get dragged into conflicts and appears to be committed to one side or another in a conflict that has nothing to do with the faith, perhaps, and also, even on the question of morals, who's right in this situation, that's not always entirely clear. Or it's possible that priests, individual priests certainly, could get involved on the wrong side. And then the church appears then to be dragged into that side. Everybody everywhere looks on priests as being representatives of the church, which of course is true to a degree. But it is possible for representatives of any entity to betray the trust entrusted to him, given to him, as a representative. It's happened in the past. Even papal legates have betrayed the trust of the popes who delegated them in various matters. That has happened. And popes have reneged on concessions made by their own legates in the past because, no, that's not what I wanted you to do. You were not supposed to go and do that or say that. Now I have to take that back because you did that and weren't supposed to. So it is possible that the true scandal be given, in other words, by priests getting involved on the wrong side of such things. This is why we have in the rules of our institute that priests no member of the institute shall get involved in any political movement. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of it. No member of the institute shall get involved in any kind of political movement, even if that movement stands for something that is true and good. Because such things can go bad very easily, among other reasons. Such things can go bad very easily. And then the church appears to be all caught up in that. Yet none of it could ever affect the holiness of the church, of course. The church's teachings would never approve of anything evil, but true scandal can be given as a result of clerics getting involved on the wrong side of things, or even getting involved at all, potentially. So, the articles provoked the anger and fear of Cardinals Maffei and Mercier, who attacked them. But St. Pius X made it known in a letter to Toniolo that the article is worthy of approbation and the reprobations are unjustified. To Father Chiodano, he said, "They're making war against you, aren't they? Hold firm. Go to the front, fight Christian unionism. Many are crying because you have put your finger on the evil." And speaking of the opposition that Don Roncalli gave to the anti-modernist policies of St. Pius X, our not-so-esteemed biographer, affirms that the future John XXIII would not have been able to express himself at the risk of incurring Roman censures if he had not had some allies. His foremost ally was his bishop, Radini Tedeschi, who himself actually supported strikes. Again, got the reputation of being a red bishop as a result, which is exactly the kind of thing that St. Pius X did not want to have happen and why he forbade priests from getting involved in those things. And Radini Tedeschi had a large circle of friends, among them Cardinal Désiré Mercier of Malines, Brussels. So you may recognize that name from the School of Louvain, which we have mentioned here later in the notes. But he was definitely involved in that. And also, Malines was, you may recall that, anybody who may have been here a couple of years ago, studying the reign of Gregory XVI, the Malines conferences, a gathering of liberals, at which Montalembert spoke. So Mercier came to Bergamo on May 4th, 1906, and Don Roncalli paid him a visit in the city. So after having taught at Louvain for almost a quarter of a century, he, Cardinal Mercier, was suddenly appointed Primate of Belgium in 1906. So that is surprising to see that would have happened during the reign of St. Pius X. And again, we'll see here in a moment that these modernists could sometimes hide their agenda. That was certainly one big thing that they learned during the reign of St. Pius X, is that you have to be subtle. At least many of them chose that route after St. Pius X shut them down for having been clear about what they thought during his reign. So, Primate of Belgium, meaning the foremost ecclesiastic in the country. You have primates of various nations, and certainly a cardinal, who is a bishop of a city, is a very high position, and in this case, the primate of the country, primate of Belgium. So Mercier was open to what modern thought had to offer him. That's putting it nicely. He appeared as an underground clearinghouse for all those who considered that mere condemnations were not the best response to modernism. And there were quite a few who thought that. Even those who opposed modernism were not all in agreement with St. Pius X that it ought to be beaten with fists, as he himself put it. That's being too hard on them. Again, even Cardinal Mary Doval, for example, was not in favor of the methods employed by the Sodalitium Pianum. In fact, I have the list of cardinals that the Sodalitium Pianum had in its files in Belgium, and they have notes on all of the cardinals, and Cardinal Mary Doval is on there as being la peur, the fear. The Sodalitium were afraid of him. Members of the Sodalitium were afraid of him because he, in fact, opposed them. And he was no liberal himself. He was definitely no modernizer or no modernist. He was very much in agreement with St. Pius X on various points, but he did not agree with the exact methods employed by the Sodalitium. And there were other cardinals who did. Say, Cardinal Delay, for example, is on here as à nous. In effect, with us. The notes were all in French, which I still plan to give those to you. But the notes that they have on them are very telling.